Well, on day 65 of Donald Trump's illegal war, Donald Trump threatened another war crime, this time telling a Fox reporter in a telephone interview that Iran will be, quote, blown off the face of the earth if Iran attacks United States Navy ships in the region. Donald Trump's war became fully illegal last week, and Donald Trump seems to know that.
What they call a military operation. You know, they don't like the word war, and they call it a military operation because that way you don't have a war, you don't have legal problems.
Legal problems. That was day 62 of Donald Trump's war, and he had a legal problem. By the time Donald Trump said that, even Donald Trump seemed to know that the War Powers Act, passed in 1973, made Donald Trump's war illegal last week. The War Powers Act says that the president can launch military operations for a maximum of 60 days, quote, unless the Congress has declared war or has enacted a specific authorization for such use of United States armed forces. And today, on the 65th day of Donald Trump's illegal war, he chose this childish language to continue his violation of the War Powers Act.
Our country's booming now, despite the fact that we're in I call it a mini war.
A mini war. On Friday, Donald Trump described his defiance of the War Powers Act without ever specifically mentioning the War Powers Act.
But you ever hear a situation where we're knocking the hell out of somebody and we have a Congress, please, you've only got 3 days left. We spent 19 years in Vietnam. We spent 12 years in Iraq. We spent 7 years in another place, 2 years in another one, 7 years in another one. We had another one for 14 years, and we're in there for 6 weeks. What's taking so long?
Congress learned its lesson with Vietnam, the war that Donald Trump refused to participate in when offered a chance by his local draft board, whereupon he presented a letter from a doctor saying that Donald Trump's feet just couldn't take a day in Army boots anywhere in the world. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed the House of Representatives and the Senate in 1964. The vote was unanimous in the House, and only 2 senators voted no. Both bodies voted on the same day. They literally did not know what they were voting for. They thought they did. They thought they knew why they were voting and what they were voting for. They voted for the president to use military force against what the resolution called, quote, the communist regime in Vietnam, end quote, because President Lyndon Johnson told Congress that North Vietnamese forces, as the resolution put it, quote, deliberately and repeatedly attacked United States naval vessels lawfully present in international waters. History would prove that was a wild exaggeration of a very minor incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. But the Congress immediately passed that resolution saying, quote, the Congress approves and supports the determination of the president as commander-in-chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It was a 1-page resolution. And the final sentence said, quote, this resolution shall expire when the president shall determine that the peace and security of the area is reasonably assured. In other words, there was no expiration date. And the resolution put no limit on what the president could do. And so President Lyndon Johnson took a minor military engagement at sea and turned it into America's biggest war since World War II. 4 years later, In the deadliest year of the Vietnam War in 1968, for American forces, the United States Army had 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. Republican President Richard Nixon won the presidential election that year and continued Lyndon Johnson's war in Vietnam without limit and expanded that war across borders into other neighboring countries. Members of Congress came to regret their vote for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and during the Nixon presidency began doing everything they possibly could to cut off funding for what had become Richard Nixon's war. The concept of the illegal war in American politics was born in Vietnam. Prosecutors of the illegal war concept held that the reporting of the Gulf of Tonkin incident in the first place by the president was false in describing a minor encounter at sea as an act of war. Therefore, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, as passed, was based on a fraud, and that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution could not have reasonably been taken as an authorization for an unlimited, forever war. By 1973, Congress was no longer content to reduce funding for the Vietnam War. They wanted to prevent the next Vietnam by writing into American law an unambiguous 60-day limit on the kind of war-making that President Lyndon Johnson created. After years of Lyndon Johnson's war, which had become Richard Nixon's war, members of Congress were insisting that what the president was doing without a declaration of war was illegal. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon never pretended that it wasn't a war. They never called it a little detour, as Donald Trump did recently. They never called it an excursion, as Donald Trump has called it. And they never pretended that it was just a military operation. And they never claimed that it would be over next week. President Johnson and President Nixon did not spend every week of their war in Vietnam claiming that it would end tomorrow or the next day or the next week. And they never said, we could leave right now.
We could leave right now. Right now, if we left right now, it would take them 20 years, 25 years to rebuild the place.
No American president acting as commander-in-chief in wartime has ever said that he could end that war right now, because every previous president serving as commander-in-chief knew that it was his moral and legal responsibility and constitutional responsibility to end that war on the first day possible and not extend it one day beyond what was absolutely necessary, not risk one more life. Quote, it would take them 20 years, 25 years to rebuild that place. The complete rebuilding of the first place on planet Earth to be hit by an atomic bomb took 10 years. Hiroshima was rebuilt in 10 years. Nagasaki was rebuilt in 10 years after being hit by the second atomic bomb used in war, which was the last nuclear weapon used in war. Larger Japanese cities like Tokyo had been bombed so thoroughly before the United States had a working atomic bomb that there weren't enough structures left in Tokyo to use it as a target for an atomic bomb. But Tokyo was rebuilt in 10 years. And Japan led that effort, that rebuilding effort across the country, without a huge stream of oil revenue that Iran could have after Donald Trump's war. So no, it won't take 20 years or 25 years to rebuild what Donald Trump has done to Iran. On day 62 of Donald Trump's war, he did this. He posted an AI image of himself with no caption to explain such a perverse choice of imagery for a president of the United States, or for any adult, but certainly for a president of the United States, who is now a wartime president. No president has ever taken war less seriously, and America does not approve. New polling continues to show Donald Trump to be waging the most unpopular war in American history on its 65th day. 65 days after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, President Johnson had the overwhelming support of Congress in the Vietnam War and very strong majority support among voters for the Vietnam War. Donald Trump is the first president in history to wage a war that a majority of Americans have opposed from day one. The New York Times reports, quote, the Middle East truce faltered on Monday as the United Arab Emirates said it had been attacked by Iran, while the U.S. military said that it had destroyed 6 Iranian military boats and that Iran had fired on American ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of the military's Central Command, said that U.S. warships shot down cruise missiles and drones that Iran fired at the ships and commercial vessels the Navy was guiding through the Strait of Hormuz. And today, Donald Trump, who has spent every day of his war trying to oversimplify his war, finally seems to be learning. It's tricky out there.
We have a war right now, and we're to like, 6 weeks? They said, what's taking so long? We were in Vietnam 19 years. We're in Iraq for many years, 10 years, 12 years. We're in all these different wars. Korea, 7 years. I won't even mention World War II. That's a big baby. But you had the wrong person up here, you'll be in World War III. As sure as you're sitting there, you have the wrong person up there. It's nasty and tricky. It's tricky out there.
It's tricky out there. Retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling will join us after this break. On Friday, Donald Trump said this.
Frankly, maybe we're better off not making a deal at all.
The next day, Donald Trump denied that he said that.
Last night you said we might be better off not making a deal.
Well, I wouldn't have to. I didn't say that.
Joining us now is Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, retired, former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. He's now an MS Now military analyst. General Hertling, I'd like to begin with this phenomenon of Donald Trump from day to day reversing himself on statements like that, which confuse the mission, I would expect, for troops serving in this arena. When a president says, we don't need to make a deal, and then says, I didn't say we don't need to make a deal, and then says we do need to make a deal. And he's done that on a bunch of other issues involved with this war. What does that do to the forces who are out there trying to understand the mission and wondering when they might be going home?
It's interesting, Lawrence, because one of the things they teach at the war colleges, which Secretary Hegseth has kind of disrespected, is that words are important, so you have to be precise. And that's especially true in the orders that you give military personnel, because based on the orders from any commander, they start executing things, they start planning new things, they adjust to the situation. So when you have this kind of back and forth that we've seen from the president and others, it just confuses your operational planning. You know, as a commander in both peacetime and combat, I would look for clear, concise orders for what I had to do. And when those orders didn't come, what I would look for the commander's intent. What do you want me to do so that I can adjust my operations, my tactics to try and meet your commander's intent? But truthfully, in watching the first 8 weeks of this operation against Iran, I've been confused in terms of what the intent is or what the precision is of the orders that the units have been given. Now, you know, that's not to say that the military has not conducted operations extremely well, and I'll be the first to say that the Navy and the Air Force and others who have been operating in the theater of Iran have been executing what they think are their orders. But truthfully, when you don't have precision in your orders and you don't know what the objective is, the end state, as we call it makes your job very difficult. And you have to be adjusting to a windsock, as we sometimes call it in the military, where the flags are moving back and forth and you're not sure what your next move is.
So Donald Trump does seem to be mindful of the existence of the War Powers Act, at least the way he's been talking lately. You can definitely see it, and I know that when the War Powers Act was passed, it was welcomed on the left side of our politics and on the anti-war side of our politics as a limiter on future actions of this sort. Although the anti-war movement was so outraged by that time that it wasn't a very satisfactory outcome in those years. But I know that it was also welcomed, certainly among some within the military, that there would be a definition, there would be a limitation. The American military would know that they would not be subject to any random president of the United States sending them off into another Vietnam for years, 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 and years, that there was a 60-day time frame where the Congress would have to be involved.
Yeah, you mentioned the Nixon administration earlier in your opening statements about what they did and why they did it and how Congress reacted to that. And that's specifically designed because wars are very easy to get into, but everyone who's been in one knows they're a whole lot harder to get out of. And I'll use the Clausewitzian term of in war, everything in war is simple, but the simplest things are difficult. And your comment about President Trump oversimplifying this action when he first got into it is critical. I was a young cadet at West Point when the War Powers Act was signed by Congress, and we had a lot of debates about that as cadets. We also saw, as I was an older soldier, the authorization of use of military force in the alleged global war on terrorism. And it was mostly the military that was saying, hey, what are you doing to authorize the military to do different actions as opposed to just lumping it under the AUMF? We're in the same situation right now that the president is playing very loosely with the definition of war, as you showed that clip earlier. And, special military operations, by the way, that sounds hauntingly familiar to something that President Putin called the invasion of Ukraine, the special
Mhm.
military operations. So I think, we're in dangerous territory and we have to define as a country what we want our soldiers to do. When we send America's young men and women into battle, we better have a good reason for it. We better have clear and concise orders, and we better understand how difficult those actions are when you put American sons and daughters in harm's way.
General, I'm fascinated by 1973 at West Point. A difficult time to be in the American military, certainly the American Army. West Point had lost the attraction that it had had in the
Mm.
early 1960s. I remember any kid who could possibly get to West Point wanted to get there. Vietnam shifted some of the enthusiasm about that. But take us into what it was like there when the War Powers Act was being debated, and how did it come into your classes, and how did it come into your thinking and other students' thinking at the time at West Point?
Well, I'm smiling, Lawrence, because I entered the academy in 1971 as a poor kid from St. Louis. And it was one of those kind of things that I entered because we didn't have a whole lot of money and I couldn't get on into another college. And it was relatively easy to get into West Point during the Vietnam War. I don't think I could get in there now. The kids are so educated and well rounded. I don't think I could compete with them. But in terms of the war going on, I was a swimmer at the academy, and distinctly remember one day at lunchtime, they used to announce the casualties off of something called the poop deck, and they would tell what classmates or what seniors when we were freshmen were killed in Vietnam. And the captain of our swim team was killed in Vietnam, and they announced it as a young second lieutenant. That brings things home when you understand the cost of combat. So when the War Powers Act was being initially debated in Congress, all of the cadets were interested in it. We talked about it in our social sciences classes about the politics of it all. We were looking more at the processes than the typical reaction to it by Congress, but it also was important for us to understand the dynamics of what causes a nation to go to war and the kinds of things that really lead to combat that we were asked to execute. So yeah, it was pretty serious business. It's not the same kind of discussions you would have at Harvard or Yale or some of
Mhm.
those other private schools, but at West Point, it was a pretty big deal back in the 70s.
General Mark Hertling, thank you very much for starting off our coverage tonight.
Pleasure, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thank you. And coming up, the Trump White House is preparing for the Democrats to win control of the House of Representatives. That's next with Congressman Robert Garcia, who will become chairman of the House Oversight Committee when the Democrats take over Congress. The Washington Post has new reporting on private briefings the White House counsel's office is giving Trump administration staff to prepare them for Democrats winning control of Congress and gaining oversight authority. The Washington Post reports staff from the counsel's office have encouraged political appointees to be careful about what they put in writing and provided guidance for how to respond to congressional inquiries in a timely manner, according to two people who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the matter publicly. At least some staff members have considered the briefings preparatory, given the growing sense across the Trump administration that the Republican Party is in trouble and that the time has come to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Joining us now is one of those worst-case scenarios, Democratic Congressman Robert Garcia of California. He is the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, on his way to being chairman of that committee if Democrats win control of the House of Representatives. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us. What would you tell White House staff to prepare for when the Democrats have control of the House of Representatives?
Well, they should save their documents and be prepared for aggressive and serious investigations. I mean, they are participating in the most corrupt administration in modern history. The president continues to enrich himself and his family. They continue to cover up the Epstein files. They're going around, and their kids and Jared Kushner are infinitely enriching themselves, their family, their donors, the largest corporations in this country. And so I'm glad those staffers are concerned. I'm glad they're going through trainings, because we are going to be relentless with our ability to subpoena, get documents, bring administration officials in front of the committee, and investigate the serious corruption that is happening across the administration and multiple agencies.
The report says administration officials, so that certainly includes White House as well as cabinet secretaries, departments, some of the people who do routinely testify to Congress. They all seem to have been trained in some kind of shout fest seminar about how to yell back at members of Congress or yell at members of Congress. Do you expect that to change when Democrats are in control of these hearings?
Look, they can yell all they want. They can try to divert attention or distract all they want, but they're going to be in front of our committee, and we're going to ask the tough questions, and we are going to be relentless in our pursuit of the truth. And look, whether they're in office or not, like Kristi Noem, for example, who may not be anymore the secretary in Homeland Security, but she's still out there. There's still likely corruption. She's out there staying at a home owned by the Coast Guard still. There's tons of reports about Corey Lewandowski and contracts, and media reports about who's actually gaining off the system. And so look, whether it's Kristi Noem, whether it's Pam Bondi, whether it's Jared Kushner, whether it's Stephen Miller, we're going to take on every single instance of corruption and accountability. The American public want to know why ICE is out there terrorizing communities. They want to know why billionaires are being protected, why people have raped women and children with no accountability. And those are the questions we're going to get answers to.
And it sounds like the investigative process spreads across pretty much every House committee, not just oversight. Homeland Security would have their own investigative interest here. Ways and Means would have its own investigative interest over what's going on, and certainly Commerce Committee. Those kinds of interests spread, especially on the corruption question, all across the committee structure of the House.
I expect every committee to be engaged in oversight, and we all should. And look, what's great about the Oversight Committee is, as you know, our jurisdiction is every agency. So we'll be able to launch investigations anywhere, at any time, in any agency, against any organization that's harming the American public. And so we're preparing, we're not waiting, by the way, we are preparing a robust list of subpoenas, of documents, of what we want to actually get justice for the survivors in the Epstein files, of the horrors that folks like Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem and Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche are causing across our government, and RFK Jr. And so the list is long, but we're going to have accountability. We will have a forward-looking agenda. And I've told folks, look, we need a forward-looking agenda. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to hold people accountable. We need to show the next generation of people, we need to show our students and our children and our community that what's happening right now is wrong. And that means oversight and accountability.
The Democrats have announced something for next week in Florida involving the Epstein survivors. What do you have planned?
Look, we have planned, the Oversight Committee is hosting a hearing in Palm Beach, Florida, obviously Donald Trump's backyard. And we're inviting and have had survivors that are joining us at this hearing. It's going to be the first opportunity since this investigation has started where survivors will come forward, answer questions from committee members, share their stories in a way that's done for the congressional record and within a hearing format. We'll have other, of course, information that we'll be presenting. And what's important is people need to understand that Palm Beach is at the center of this investigation. There have been numerous reports about Mar-a-Lago being a place where women were recruited, oftentimes to go work at Jeffrey Epstein's home. We know that Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were incredibly close. Jeffrey Epstein had his home in Palm Beach, including, of course, in New York, including the island. And so much happened around Palm Beach, including Alex Acosta and his horrific investigation, and eventually him dismissing so many prosecutors from Florida that try to go after Epstein, that try to go after co-conspirators. And he instead decided to give Epstein a sweetheart deal. And so all of that will be front and center as we in the Oversight Committee, Democrats, go into Palm Beach, host this hearing, and I think put together a really strong case of where this investigation is going next.
And you have the Pam Bondi questioning scheduled for the end of the month, but that seems to have taken a very strange turn with the Republican chairman of the committee giving her a special process that we haven't seen before.
Right. Look, James Comer, as chair of the committee, has the ability to make this a videotape deposition, making it a transcribed interview without videotape. And that's the power of the committee chairman, which is why we have to win the majority. But what we have said has been very clear. This is an important interview. She will have to, of course, be truthful, but that also means we need to have that recording. There needs to be a videotape of the interview and needs to be released to the American public. If James Comer thinks we're going to have a transcribed interview with no videotape and no release of that transcript to the public, we are not going to allow that. So we've been very clear. It is our decision and it's our demand that that's videotaped. And in addition to that, right now we know that a DOJ attorney, Ms. Dillon, who actually runs a bunch of civil rights operations at the DOJ and has now been elevated at the DOJ, that she is also going to be the private counsel for the former attorney general, yet she works for the DOJ. And so it's an incredibly strange setup that Mr. Comer is allowing. So we're calling it out, and hopefully this will get resolved before the actual hearing at the end of the month.
Congressman Robert Garcia, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And coming up, when law professor Kimberly Crenshaw watched Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas be confirmed, she said, "This is going to change the rest of our lives." Professor Crenshaw will join us next on the Supreme Court's latest attack on the Voting Rights Act and her new book, Backtalker, an American Memoir. That's next. The Wall Street Journal editorial board started its Sunday editorial, The Triumph of Clarence Thomas, with a milestone. Congratulations to Clarence Thomas, who this week will become the second longest serving Supreme Court justice in history. This wasn't what most legal experts expected when President George H.W. Bush elevated Judge Thomas from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals at age 43 in 1991. Clarence Thomas voted with the Republican majority on the Supreme Court last week, in effect repealing part of the Voting Rights Act. As Justice Elena Kagan wrote in her dissent, this decision renders Section 2 all but a dead letter. In the states where that law continues to matter, the states still marked by residential segregation and racially polarized voting, minority voters can now be cracked out of the electoral process. The latest chapter in the majority's now completed demolition of the Voting Rights Act. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw is not surprised. She worked to defeat Clarence Thomas' nomination to the Supreme Court as a member of Anita Hill's legal team in 1991. In her wonderful new book, Backtalker, an American memoir, Professor Crenshaw writes, the hopes that several Black leaders placed in Clarence Thomas's upbringing as Black and poor did little to stop him from repeatedly ruling against Black and poor people. His Deep South roots, where for decades African American voters had been disenfranchised and worse, did nothing to discourage Thomas from helping to gut the Voting Rights Act, widely regarded as the crown jewel of the civil rights era. His vote in Citizens United helped put our republic on a fire sale, eventually making it possible for an autocrat to rule over the most powerful democracy in the world. And Professor Crenshaw writes this about what she expected on the day Clarence Thomas was confirmed in 1991. When at last Thomas was confirmed, I whispered, "This is going to change the rest of our lives." Joining us now is Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She's Distinguished Professor of Law and the Promise Institute Chair in Human Rights at UCLA and Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. She is the co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum. Her new book is Backtalker, an American memoir, and it is available everywhere at midnight tonight and going forward. Kimberly, so glad you're back. So glad you're here with this book. This is just a remarkable story. I've always known you're remarkable. Now I know so much more. We're focusing on Clarence Thomas because of the Voting Rights Act last week, but there's so much more in this book, and I hope we get to so much more in this book. But that quote, that line of yours, on the day that he was confirmed, there was still hope. I was working.
You
in the
might have
Senate.
been hopeful.
No, I wasn't by that time. But working in the Senate, I know there was still hope.
Yeah.
That maybe when this guy gets on the court,
Yeah.
maybe he won't be like one of those reactionary Republicans. Turns out he's the leader of the pack.
Well, absolutely one of the most powerful Supreme Court justices ever. And, the folks were not alone in being hopeful. A lot of very famous and respected people believed that if we just leave the lights on, Clarence Thomas will come home. Maya Angelou wrote an op-ed in the New York Times around that time saying, because he was Black and because he grew up poor in the South, there's something deep inside him that he will rediscover. The SCLC, which was Martin Luther King's organization, they supported Clarence Thomas. He had support from across the Black political spectrum and also within some of the traditional civil rights groups because they thought that there was something deeply embedded in him. I was not optimistic at all. I remembered what he had done at the EEOC. I remembered how he had slowed enforcement. I remembered how he talked about civil rights leaders. I remembered how he talked about his own sister. I saw this person as a dyed-in-the-wool, deeply conservative individual who was not going to somehow rediscover some deep connection to communities
And
of
most
color.
importantly, about everything you just described,
Yes.
all policy you were opposed to his nomination before Anita
Before.
Hill revelations.
That's right.
Everything you just cited was before the Anita Hill
All that
revelations.
was true. All that was already well known. But the line that I say in the book, that our lives are going to be changed forever, was followed by a line by the person who ended up co-founding the African American Policy Forum with me. And what he said is, all because we refused to believe a Black woman. So
Mhm.
what we got from Clarence Thomas, from the failure to credit what Anita Hill had to say, is the end of meaningful campaign finance reform.
Mhm.
What we got was the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. What we got was undermining other kind of protections that people bled for, some people died for. He was that fifth vote that undermined the structure of civil rights enforcement. So it's a story about the failure to understand Black women's experiences, and I call it a huge intersectional failure. You had anti-racist groups really responding to this high-tech lynching idea, and Anita Hill didn't have anything that she could have said that would have rallied the forces in the same way.
So this is a memoir about much more than
Yes.
just that crusade and many other crusades. One of the things that interests me right now as a subject for with people that are talking about how difficult it is coming out of college now, starting off in the world now. What made you start in the direction you started, and how did you get your start?
Oh, well, my story is one in which my family, my mother, my father, they were called race men of the 20th century. They were people who fought against the barriers, the obstacles, but also thought it was important to make sure that we were prepared to walk through those doors when they finally opened. I was that generation that was not born into a state of freedom. I was born before the Voting Rights Act, before the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 65. So that was just an imagination, a possibility that they were preparing us for. But one of the ways that my family did prepare me for that was to make sure that I had something to say, that I wasn't just living life, I just wasn't letting it pass me by, that I observed what my life was, that I had something to say about it. And I actually had to come to the dinner table every night with something to offer to the conversation. So I was always the person who was observing, I was asking questions. If it didn't make sense to me, I would keep asking questions. And that's more or less what led me to some of the observations about how race was functioning in my life, and then how gender was also functioning to shape and delimit some of the possibilities.
And how did you expect progress when it was achieved to work? I mean, a lot of people, I think, before the age of Trump thought progress goes straight ahead and you never really go backwards, and you might slow down, you might get stuck for a while, but you don't go backwards.
Yeah,
We have experienced what it feels like to go backwards.
that's
Was that a surprise to you that there was a possibility?
It wasn't a surprise because one of the things that happened in my household, and I talk about this in the book, in a lot of Black households, there's a picture of the Kennedys. There's a picture, perhaps, of Martin Luther King and a picture of Jesus. In my home, there was also a picture of the Black congressmen from the 19th century, the Black elected officials at the House of Representatives and the Senate. So I grew up knowing that there was a time earlier in our history when we had more, that we had political power, and it had been lost. So the idea of forward momentum and backward trajectory was always part of my awareness. My first law review article was called Race, Reform, and Retrenchment. So I always knew retrenchment was possible. I think this last retrenchment after 2020, it happened so quickly, and it happened so profoundly, and it happened after the most powerful mass movement that this country has ever known. Every state in the union had protests, multiracial, cross generations, people being activated by injustice, and knowing that when people see something, they can feel something and demand something. I think it was that actually activated those who decided, you know what, we're going to take these ideas away from them. We're going to take this history away from them. We're going to take the ability to protest away from them because it's too scary to see what's possible in this country when people are activated by injustice.
Kimberly Crenshaw, I could not be happier that you're here on your first night of having this book out in the world. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's new book is Backtalker, an American memoir. It is an important new book, and it is available in an hour online and at your bookstore tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren.
Professor Kimberly Williams Crenshaw's new book is called Backtalker, and that is tonight's last word, Backtalker.